Welcome to our last podcast for our intergenerational group for this semester. I am Jeremiah Childers.
And I'm Kelly Kirksey.
Today we are reflecting over our time together as we as groups have been talking about the Sermon on the Mount. This week you as groups will reflect on your time together, talking about the things that have stuck out to you and how God has been working in and through the conversations that we've had. So Kelly, as you've thought about this last semester, even though we had kind of a break with our Lenten journey, what are some things that have stood out to you that you've reflected on from our time?
Yeah, I think I have just been overwhelmed with the way that God has been working in all of the groups. You know, this kind of started as this big experiment to see if, in sharing our stories, we could create connection with each other, even, people of very different generations, the Gen Z to the silent generation. And I think over the last really 9 months, because of the fall period also, that I have just seen so many ways that people have connected and have built relationships, and how God is just creating unity within that, and getting to know each other. I mean, people who would never have known each other because they're not in Sunday school classes together. Maybe they would see someone up on stage, or if they would hear their testimony after we come back from a youth trip or something like that, but not really know their story. And so I think that has been, and to hear, people have said, this has become like a family to me. Like, I'm so excited to get back with my group because I've just really missed them. And I can't believe we're almost done because this has become really part of my life now. And, that doesn't really have anything to do with me and you, Jeremiah.
Yeah.
You just kind of go where you feel like God is leading you, and you just hope for the best, And so that's just really God at work.
Well, I've enjoyed both our earlier part of the fall season where we were able to listen to each other's stories. And I think doing that to begin with helped to kind of bring us together, to let us see each other for who we really are. Maybe the barriers that sometimes we put on people because of different generations kind of went away when we really began to see that, at least in my group, that our stories were so similar, even though they occurred over different decades and there were different experiences. I've also enjoyed, this semester doing something that is not Bible study, but allowing the Bible to be a part of our conversations, especially as we've reflected on Jesus. And using this podcast has been a way to allow people that weren't a part of our intergenerational small groups to kind of overhear some of the conversations we're having.
Yeah.
And hopefully that will entice them, maybe next year, as hopefully in the fall that we kind of relaunch some new small groups to get them invited. When you think about the group that you have led and the group that I have led, what are some of the one or two standouts? I know we can't share each other's stories, but really that just kind of stood out to you in those.
I think just how comfortable people are sharing things that are pretty personal, and with people that they didn't grow up with. I think we as a society as a whole don't share our stories very often, and we don't have to because we're online all the time and we're watching TV, or we're watching other people's stories all the time, but they're not the people we actually live with. And so watching that develop where people have become more comfortable just sharing their own thoughts and sharing their own stories. And I've loved about this semester the starting question of like how you've seen God. I think that I have noticed in my own life, like I'll come out of my house and the sky is beautiful, and I'm like, oh, like this is God. And I've noticed my brain kind of training itself to look for God in places, which was something I just didn't really expect. It's not that I don't ever look for God or think about God, but but I think having that constant reminder, especially in those first 6 weeks when we had met every single week, knowing, well, I'm going to have to answer this question, kind of train my brain to be like, hey, listen, you're going to see God everywhere. So start looking.
Yeah.
So.
One of the things I've really enjoyed from our group, both semesters, is seeing that by sharing some of our difficult stories with each other, we have found places where we can find encouragement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sharing those stories, but also receiving the gift from each other of not just being prayed for, but every week following up with questions. How is things going this week? You were struggling last week with this.
Mm-hmm.
Being involved in each other's life from a deeper way than a lot of times in church it becomes really superficial.
Yeah.
Even in groups of people we've known for years, because we've not given permission to each other to be vulnerable.
Right.
And part of our covenants with each group is that we are able to talk freely about things, but know that our privacy, but also our dignity will be guarded.
Yeah.
So that, anything we say won't be shared with others. And I think that by having that covenant that you've kind of helped us with through your doctoral work, helped us give that space that really becomes a holy space,
mm-hmm.
where we are able to freely give and to freely receive. And someone who's taught Sunday school for years, someone who's led small groups and Bible studies, that's not always the case. The closest I've seen that work is in support groups that we've had at the church, where everybody's come together over a loss or over an issue, and you're really able to be honest and open. And that's really what church should be about.
Right.
Where you could really be your authentic self, both the positive things that's going on in your life and the negative things and your stories. So I've really enjoyed seeing that people can find a place to really open up, but also to be filled.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's been interesting. There's been a few topics this semester, not last semester, but this semester, that it's almost like people needed to share their stories, and they were almost confessional. Mm-hmm. Where it was like, yeah, I don't tell people this because it doesn't paint me in a great light.
Yeah.
Where we're talking about judgment or the way we view people or the way we've viewed people in the past, where, and it was neat to be able to, like, because as Baptists we don't do confession, like that's not part of our the way that we do church. And so, but it's good for people to be able to say, this is something that I've done.
Yeah.
And in a space where no one's going to say, well, you're a terrible person.
Yeah.
Or, well, I hope that you have prayed real long and hard about that because God's going to need to forgive you because no one else is,
Yeah.
And to be able to say, like, yeah, like, guess what? We have all done these things, and to have, and once one person says, I, this is what I did, this is what I experienced, whether it's something done to you or something you've done to someone else, once one person shares something like that, the space becomes very sacred.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden people are invited onto this holy ground of, like, it doesn't matter what generation you're in. We have all treated people as less than human.
Yeah.
We have all not gone the extra mile. We've all looked at someone and viewed them as our enemy and wanted to hit back. We've all done these things, and it's important to be able to come in with honesty and with authenticity and say, like I'm broken.
Yeah.
And then it opens the door for other people to say, yeah, me too.
Well, and part of going back to our beginning of this session of the Sermon on the Mount is to create space where people can take off the mask they wear. And also to be aware is that you don't have to put them back on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that authentic who you are, church should be the place you should be who you really are.
Right.
And a lot of times that's the place where the least likely who we really are.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're afraid that even in God's house that God might judge us, which Jesus says, and then, or sometimes we're afraid that other followers of Jesus are going to judge us. And this should be the safest place in the world to be who you are, so that in being who you are, you can hear God's calling to become who you're meant to be.
Right.
And I've really enjoyed going through the Sermon on the Mount and allowing people to kind of process some of the harder teachings of Jesus. But for me, are the teachings that I go back to the most in the Bible to say, here's where I was, here's where I am, here's where I want to go, Lord. Help me.
Yeah.
And that's what that discipleship, that being a student of Jesus, is a continual process. And I've enjoyed seeing the different generations talk about their struggles and the way that they struggle with some of these things, and how in some ways they are different. You know, when we talk about how social media or how those kind of things impact somebody at a younger age versus an older age.
Right.
The reality is, you know, for some of our older adults, not having the pressures of always having to be on that some of our younger folks do. And those are things that I think have opened each other's eyes and build empathy.
Right.
That maybe wasn't there before.
Yeah.
And some of the challenges that each of us face in different stages of our life become more empathetic. You know, people that are retired and getting older, having to do things that, you know, someone in their 20s and 30s hasn't considered.
Yeah.
Whether that's caring for a parent, whether that's caring for a spouse, whether that is the reality is that you've lost people in your life that, you know, a younger person hasn't realized that that's going to happen. So I think it's been helpful to kind of allow people to see not just each other, but also the fullness of what the Christian life looks like. And where we're all a part of that, but also how we can love and support each other on the different stages of the journey.
I think for something that's been really interesting too in this second semester that we've done this is the integration of the Bible, you know, and the idea that we're coming together not to analyze the text but to share our stories that intersect with the text. And so I think that's been really hard, actually. You know, even in our podcast, it's much easier for me to sit down and talk about the Bible.
Yeah.
And it's more like, I guess it's just the way we've always done church. I would say most churches, that is how it works. You know, in Sunday school, you talk about the Bible, and there's not a ton of personal, okay, where does this, I mean, it is like, okay, what do I learn from this? And how can I do a life application? But what we're doing here is not really life application either. It really is more like, okay, where have I seen this in my life?
Yeah.
Where is this already happening in my life? And sharing those stories, which has been hard for me because it's so unusual to and I have to continuously bring myself back to that and say, yeah, we're not analyzing the text here, Kelly. I mean, we can a little bit, but the point really is to share your stories about where you see this in your life. Because what Jesus is talking about is not just a book.
Yeah.
What he's talking about is every single day life.
One of the things I've noticed, at least in Bible studies that do application, which is great. I'm not saying that it's not, and even preaching that does application.
And there's room for that. Don't hear me saying that is not important. It is.
One of the things I've noticed is a lot of times it gives big picture application, but it's hard to see yourself always in those big picture applications. And the way that we've approached the text this time is to say, okay, if we are sitting with Jesus and Jesus is teaching us and we're having that conversation with Jesus about our lives.
Right.
You know, where do I struggle to forgive? Okay, well, I've got to tell stories that share that.
Yeah.
Where have I been forgiven? I've got to share a story about that.
Yeah.
And it allows us to come into the text in such a way that we can look at ourselves and say, this is where the story of God, the teachings of Jesus are playing out right here, right now. And it's application, but it is almost as though the text is, we're invited to be in the text.
Right.
And it's less generic application and specifically towards each of us.
Yeah.
And the more that I read Scripture, the more that I study Scripture, I'm always asking myself those questions. In this story, whether it's a parable, whether it's a story in the Gospels, whether it's a story in the Old Testament, whether it's a psalm, where do I see myself?
Mm-hmm.
Where do I see the people around me? Who do I identify with?
Yeah.
How does this story or this Scripture challenge me here and now, but also invite me to be a part of the story in a new way? And coming to the Sermon on the Mount, it's easy to come to it because Jesus is inviting us to look at our own lives.
Right.
But it's also challenging because the more I come to it, the deeper I go into it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that some life application is it just remains superficial.
Right.
And having to tell your story and share your story causes you to go farther and farther into a deeper relationship with Jesus, a deeper relationship with God, a deeper relationship with others, but also a deeper relationship with the teaching, with the text. And I think that allows the Spirit to make it more alive.
Yeah, I was talking to someone about this semester, and they said, it's just been harder. And I thought that was really interesting. I was like, tell me more about that. And one of the things they said was just, it's pushing us further. Mm-hmm. And I think part of looking at the Sermon on the Mount and trying, the questions of, who, like, when is a time when you've been judged? Yeah. Or, when did you feel authentically yourself? And I think it forces us also to just be more self-aware.
Yeah.
Looking back at our lives and saying, okay, when have I done this? When have I not done this? Is it different now?
Yeah.
And those are, because truly, when you know yourself better and you're more honest with yourself, you're also more honest with God. And then you can be more honest with others. And truly, it's humbling. Because unless you can admit, like, yeah, I've done some of these things, and yeah, I've looked at other people in a way that was not kind, or I've said things that have been hurtful. Like, once we say those out loud, then we don't look at the person across from us and think, like, well, you're a jerk.
Yeah.
Because we're like, guess what? I am too.
Well, I can only imagine, Jesus talking, let's say, about judgment, because that's one we've recently done. And the disciples are sitting around, and Matthew the tax collector's there.
Mm-hmm.
And every day they're still frustrated.
Yeah.
He was a tax collector. He stole from his own people.
Yeah.
And Jesus is saying to not only forgive, but also to love. So if they can learn to do it within their own community,
right,
which they're having to do over and over again.
Yeah.
It would have been funny to have listened to Jesus teach this publicly and then the disciples privately and had them share their stories.
Yeah.
And you could probably hear one of the disciples saying, I really struggle with Matthew.
Right. I have to sit here with him every day and eat food with him, and I know he stole from me.
Yeah.
And I can't get that money back.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't. Matthew's not Zacchaeus.
No.
Right. There's no record of him saying, I'm going to give back 4 times what I've taken.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it was all gone.
Yeah.
I know that when I get money, it tends to be gone. So he probably couldn't give it back. But
and over and over again, when maybe somebody has been rude or mean to the disciples or to Jesus, and Jesus says to turn the other cheek, and they're like, remember last week when that Pharisee came up and we were just eating some grain from the field because we were hungry, and he came and chastised us? Mm-hmm. I wanted to slap him across the face. And Jesus come alongside and said, really, what would that have done? What would that have solved?
Right.
So we can only, I think for us, as we have these conversations, we can put ourselves in the place and be with Jesus and allow Jesus to teach us as he would have taught those first disciples. And I think the conversations we have together bring life to our faith.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it just has been a different way of viewing the text, and I appreciate that. And, like I said before, people's willingness to be vulnerable. Because this whole thing doesn't work if people are not willing to be vulnerable. You could sit for 10 weeks and not share anything, and you will get nothing.
Yeah.
But the willingness of people to share, that's what really creates those connections and creates that empathy that you were talking about, and allows us to get to know one another in a deeper level.
Yeah. I always think it's curious, at least looking backwards in my history within church, is oftentimes those trips that we take with people where we get outside of our comfort zone, where we share stories, where we listen, where we laugh, where we cry, whether it's a mission trip or a retreat or something, are often those times that we look back on with fond memories.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was hard, sometimes it was fun, sometimes it was frustrating, but those are the places where for me, sometimes we step outside of the ordinary into a place where we get to know people at a deeper level.
Yeah.
And I think for the intergenerational small group, that's a microcosm of a larger experience that some people only have once or twice in their
Right.
lives in church. And we're offering this in a weekly fashion, and it's only 45 minutes, but
Yeah.
it's made a big impact. And you can't come away from those experiences and not look at the people that were with you the same way you did before.
Right. Yeah, I do. I think it does kind of correlate a lot to retreats. I've thought about that before, because retreats are fun, and I think sometimes people think like, well, this is just the youth going off and having fun and, learning some, but, what's the point? They're really just going on vacation for a weekend. But the truth is that's where like the deepest bonds are formed.
Yeah.
And it's, because you share things at nighttime and over a campfire and, in these moments that you don't share other times.
Yeah. And mission trips are the same way. You don't see people in their nice clothes, their makeup. You see them with sweat, and you see them unkept, and you see who they really are, probably closer to what they are at home.
Yeah.
And like Jesus telling us to take away some of those masks, having these experiences give us permission to let go of some things that we try to cover up, so that we can be who we really are. And I've really appreciated that in our small group.
Yeah, that's what I have seen as well, that ability to get close really quickly, which I truly didn't know if that was possible outside of a retreat, which is hard because adults don't really take retreats.
Yeah.
Senior adults don't normally go on retreat weekends. Not that they don't, some, do, but not like you can have participation in, every week on a Wednesday night, and continuously building. When you go on a retreat, you come back and you had an emotional high, or you were in a different setting, which also kind of creates a division from when you come home. And so though those people you've built a foundation with them on that trip, and you've bonded, it doesn't always continue. I mean, you always have that experience you had together, but unless you continue to foster that, it's just a person that I knew one time. But the willingness to come back every week, and I have been so thankful that people have committed to being here. I mean, because you are not going to get that experience if you are not here.
Well, and whether it's the small group I'm in, or the small group that Amber's in, or some of the others, one thing I've noticed is people in the groups, when they're in worship, when they're in an event, or they're just around each other, that normally didn't have a relationship. I watch them as they'll meet each other's eyes, and they'll come to each other, and they'll give each other a hug, and they'll check on each other, or they'll go out of their way to find one another. And they didn't have that relationship before we started the intergenerational small group. And for me, that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Because it does allow us to go outside of those comfort areas to meet people, to build relationships, and hopefully those relationships will continue and thrive. And I think it helps to make the church bigger. The numbers didn't change.
Right.
But it's bigger in that you see people you didn't see before.
Mm-hmm.
And you know who they are. And now you have a bigger community.
Right.
Than you had before.
Right. And you're not just saying, hey, how are you doing? You're saying, like, I know where you work. I know what's going on in your life. Like, how's your mom? How are your kids? You know, you're asking more personal questions because you know more about the person's life, you know. And so even, you know, the importance of, you know, we learn this in church work a lot, but of just calling out someone's name.
Yeah.
You know, knowing someone's name. You may know who they are, but you don't know their name, you know. And so even just that is so important. But then taking it, you know, that step further of like, well, I know quite a bit about your life.
Yeah.
You know, and I know that in this sermon, this was going to affect you this way.
Yeah.
And I can check on you when it's over because I know what happened to you, you know, in your first marriage, or I know what happened to you when you were little, and that this, you know, Father's Day may be really hard for you. Mother's Day may be really hard for you. And it's because I wouldn't know those things otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's really special.
Yeah.
You know, so.
And I, you know, one of the things I've heard from other groups and even from our own is that once you hear somebody's story and you can kind of put yourself into their shoes, some of those assumptions you had, some of those biases you've had about other people start to go away.
Mm-hmm.
Because for the first time in a long time, maybe you've heard how life is for somebody else, and you know what? Maybe I shouldn't carry those stereotypes anymore.
Right.
I didn't know how hard it was for your age group or your gender or your generation compared to mine.
Yeah.
And I think that's just been a beautiful thing, is that I've seen people, for good reason, soften their hearts.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't do that by watching the news. You can't do that by just hearing a sermon. You have to do that by getting to know people and see people and hear their stories.
Yeah. And so, you know, last semester I did a lot of one-on-one interviews. And we had our session at the end that was a reflective session. And we won't have that this semester. So I would appreciate if anyone has any thoughts on, you know, both, like in comparison of the two semesters and what went well, what didn't go as well. You know, I would love to hear, you know, people's reflections on that, because we had that time in the first semester where we all got to sit down and say, you know, kind of what we liked or what we didn't. And yeah, I would love for people to let me know kind of how it went for them.
Yeah.
So.
And I think one thing that we can do is always be willing to adjust a little bit.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the things, since you're asking the question,
yeah,
45 minutes is hard.
It is hard. I know it's hard. Now that has more to do with children's programming.
I know it does. I know.
And, you know, we've got to be cognizant of our children's workers.
I take it back, Kelly.
I'm just saying that hour.
I know.
You know, it's a bewitching hour for children.
It is.
So,
but I really enjoyed it, and I thank you for bringing this from your doctoral work that started us off. I thank you for allowing me to be a part of it and coming up with this podcast so that we can include maybe
this
people.
podcast was your idea, Jeremiah.
It was my idea.
Give, you know, that was you. I did not know. I have never done a podcast. I thought, I may hate this. I'm not sure how it's going to go, but I've loved it.
I've loved it. I think it gives people an opportunity to think a little bit deeper about what we're going to talk about, but it also allows people that aren't a part of the intergenerational small group to hear a little bit about what we're doing, but also we've been able to use it now for the Lenten season, and we'll use it outside of the intergenerational groups too. This summer we're hoping to do a few little series of podcasts, and we'll keep it going because I enjoy doing it.
I love doing it. I have really, really enjoyed it.
And several people have mentioned that it helps them go to sleep.
Well, there you go.
There we go. So, well, as we close our time for me and you to do this last intergenerational small podcast for this season, what's your last thoughts?
I'm just super grateful, you know, like just a deep sense of gratitude for the people last semester who took a chance, because I think people were very scared when it started. The idea of sharing your story is overwhelming for a lot of people, and being in small groups and all of these things. And so their willingness to do it and then to continue this semester. And we added people. And I've had people come up and say, if we do it again, I want to make sure to do it. And so I just am so grateful. And like I said before, that people were willing to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm grateful because I had my project last semester, obviously. But even more so because I think it makes the church healthier. Yeah. I think it makes us a better community. I think it is the way of Jesus. Yeah. And, you know, you can't make people be vulnerable. You can't make people want to be in community with each other and be their authentic selves. We choose that ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just so grateful that people have said, all right, this is scary. And I don't always want to share everything that I am, but I'm willing to step out on this limb with this group of people. Yeah. That's been amazing.
Well, as you listen to this last one, if you're a part of our intergenerational small groups, over the summer, talk to folks in the church that weren't a part of it and say, hey, really think you'd be interested in this. Here's my experience. You can maybe tell some of the things you've taken away from it. Also give us feedback to what we could do differently in the fall. And if you're just listening to this and not been a part of the intergenerational small group, we invite you this fall. You'll hear more information through our newsletter, through our other places about when we'll start and how you can register to be a part of that before our official start date. So we look forward to hopefully seeing you a part of our small groups.
Yeah, and keep in touch with your people. You know, I know the summer is a time where we all disperse and we go our own directions, but, you know, make sure to check in with each other because you have built relationships, and it'd be sad to see those go to the wayside.
That's right. Well, have a good week. We look forward to seeing you for our last session. Make sure to come to dinner and enjoy dinner, our last Wednesday night dinner until the fall.
Yep, we'll be excited to see you there.
Bye-bye.
Bye.